Thanks, David.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending today's Lunch and Learn session. I'm David Shaw, the Publishing Director for Family Business Magazine, and I hope that you and your fellow family members and your employees remain in good health. This is another in our short series that we've been conducting on Fridays from the end of last year through the beginning of this year that expands on topics that we covered at our Family Business Legacy and Wealth Conference in Chicago last September. We'll be addressing a variety of topics as we have throughout all of this, and I hope you find it interesting and informative. Our goal with Family Business Legacy is to help owners and shareholders of operating family businesses and enterprises, as well as family offices, navigate the complex issues surrounding wealth generation and transfer. Today, we have two brief sessions, one on finding the balance between maintaining control and being transparent and inclusive with the next generation. And that is followed by a session that looks at the number one threat to family wealth, which I think you'll find fascinating. So some quick housekeeping details. As always, if you've attended one of our webinars, you know that we welcome your questions. Please use the ask a question button that's underneath the video screen and enter your questions and comments throughout the presentation. We'll get to as many as we can. We're going to go for no more than 60 minutes today, basically two 30-minute sessions. And of course, the presentation you see here will be emailed to you following the webinar, so you'll have this on track. As I mentioned, the first of our two sessions looks at bridging the gap between transparency, control, and liquidity. And this is presented by Graham McConnell, who is the co-founder and CEO of Nth Round. I'm really pleased to welcome you, Graham, and let me get you back on screen here. There we go. And enjoy the session with Graham, and I'll be back with your questions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, David, and good afternoon, everyone, or I guess depending on where you are, could be good morning as well. Happy Friday, I'll leave it at that. So as David said, my name is Graham McConnell. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Nth Round. And just I want to take a couple of minutes just to give a background on what we are, who we are. We are an equity management and communications platform. We're headquartered actually just down the street from our friends at Family Business Magazine in Philadelphia. Go Eagles. I co-founded the company with my dad, so I sometimes will joke that I'm a G 1.5 or something like that. And what we do is we help family businesses, especially those with complex ownership, which, as you know, as many of us know, is almost all of them. And some of the things that we do with them is, it's two sides. One is helping the administrator or someone within the company to understand and know who owns what and communicate with everyone and keep track of all kinds of information about their shareholders. But proxy voting is a big one. Collecting signatures is a big. Speaking of proxy voting, signatures are normally part of that. The administrator also can keep a ledger of all the transactions through history of the company, which goes quite a ways back for some companies, and it's fun to see how that equity has changed hands through time. And that's so that's the administrator side, and then for the shareholders, we provide a really seamless experience. And actually, our next slide kind of shows a little bit what that looks like. We're not trying to overcomplicate things. We like to keep a pretty clean look to our software. And so the screen on the left there shows what a dashboard can look like. It's very different depending on what the company looks like. But basically trying to get shareholders to easily understand what their ownership is, and really appreciate that ownership in any way that we can. So that's all all the time I'll spend talking about us. But our topic today is actually three topics that we deal with a lot. Transparency, and then along with that, as soon as you start thinking about transparency, control comes to mind, and liquidity. So we just felt like those three topics, they're really at this intersection, and we, having been to many conferences with Family Business Magazine and talking to people, those are just topics that people that are constantly at the top of people's minds. So we'll talk about kind of best practices. How transparent should we be with our shareholders? Meeting liquidity demands, and how to communicate around that, and then also engaging the next generation. That's a topic that people are constantly talking about, because especially as you get to third, fourth, fifth generation, it's a big challenge. Why should we care about transparency? This might seem like a silly question for families that are in third or more generation, but we'll sometimes run into founders that are very they play things close to the vest, so to speak, and like a lot of control. But eventually, a company needs a level of transparency within the pool of shareholders, and I think that goes without being said. So, even with that being said, only 53% of companies globally have an investor relations strategy, a written investor relations strategy. It might be in someone's head, but to have it written, that's a pretty surprising statistic. It really helps the next generation. I read a really interesting statistic that by 2025, 75% of the workforce will be millennials, and I'm actually a millennial myself, and that statistic really surprised me. So, the next generation is upon us, is here, and so we want to get that next generation involved, and I think transparency is the way to do that. It keeps shareholders happy, promotes patience, appreciating the ownership in the company, reduces one-off requests. If you can point to your communications and say, this is the information that we've made available to you, and we're not going to we're not going to treat any shareholder differently because they're bothering us. It controls the narrative, obviously, and then it goes beyond simple disclosures. There is strategy and vision that I think shareholders are yearning to get that level of information, and so transparency is a great way to achieve that. We think of transparency in kind of three different buckets. How transparent should I be? It completely depends. Every business is different. We have a philosophy that more is better. I have trouble thinking about situations where companies have actually gone too far and are too transparent. I can't think of any. So kind of as a baseline, we think of reporting, and I'm going to go through each of these topics in a little bit of detail, just at a high level. So baseline is reporting. In between, next would be engaging shareholders, collecting information from shareholders, and then finally delighting shareholders, and that's really where we like to operate. Keeping shareholders really, really happy. So, starting with just reporting, here's a few things that we think of when we hear reporting. Stock certificates. Not all companies do these anymore, and you can digitize them quite nicely, but that's a pretty baseline thing for shareholders to have. Getting paper mailings, nothing wrong with snail mail. To have something physical for shareholders to look at. Annual shareholder meetings. These, obviously with COVID, have not been in person as much, but are very important, and I would say are pretty commonly done. K1s, you got to send them out if you're a partnership. That's about all to be said about that. And then financials. We see a lot of different levels of financials shared with shareholders. Certainly, there's no requirement depending on how the company is operated, but even a cursory level of financials, and the company's standing, I think that's pretty baseline for for companies to give to shareholders. Next up is engaging. So composite tax elections. This doesn't apply to everyone, but we talk to companies that they're reporting, they're operating across the country, and they need to collect information from shareholders to know how they would like their taxes to be filed. Surveys, these can be very simple, like has your marital status changed or has your address changed? But they can also go a lot further in asking, what do you want to talk about at this year's shareholder meeting? Or, what's your appetite for liquidity? So gathering that kind of information, it makes shareholders feel like they're appreciated and being heard. Voting, this usually applies to like changes in management, but again, another way of kind of collecting a consensus from the shareholder base. And then lastly, family council, which is covered pretty extensively by a lot of the other providers that Family Business Magazine works with. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time there, but obviously having a family council is another great way to engage your shareholders. Lastly, and this is our wheelhouse.
Graham, I'm sorry, before you go on to delighting, there was a question, and it goes back to an earlier slide. You mentioned the investor relations strategy. What do you recommend going into such? What should such a strategy be composed of?
Well, I think so. At a baseline, I think just having documentation readily available. So, like if there is a shareholder agreement, or if there is a buy-sell agreement, you can just make that available to everyone, and that could be the policy. We make these, all of our signed agreements available to everyone, and but it depends on, as you get to 30 or more shareholders, then it starts to, you better say, okay, here's our policy for shareholder meetings. So I would say, as with all of this, it really depends, because then we see companies that are hundreds of shareholders and they have quite formal investor relations strategies. So I know that's maybe a little bit of a cop-out, but it is very much depends on the size.
Got it. If you've seen one investor strategy, you've seen one investor strategy in some ways. Okay, great. Thank you. I'll get out of your way.
Thank you. So last topic here is delighting. This is really where we like to operate. How can we really make shareholders quite happy, and allow them to better appreciate the value of their ownership. So, valuation insights. This is one. Valuations can be done many different ways. If it's done by a third party, that's a pretty easy answer. This third party did our valuation. But we also see companies that have a formula for their valuation. They're looking at comparables or at EBITDA, and that kind of information, at least making it available to shareholders, I think that will fend off questions that may arise around valuation. Providing all of this, just as kind of I was hinting at to David, having all of this documentation available to everyone. And it's a different question whether you're going to expect everyone to read their buy-sell agreement or to read the shareholder agreement, because as we all know, that they're not terribly human readable documents, or they don't always tend to be that way. So I think there's also ways of condensing information that's just basically more consumable for shareholders. So anyway, mobile on-demand access, the next generation, as we all know, is consuming information through the internet. And so I think making all of this information available to you on your phone is really delightful. Video updates, is something that I would say is very bleeding edge. We do it kind of just because we believe in it. And actually, I personally find that it takes me a lot less time to record a 5-minute or 10-minute video update for shareholders than it would for me to write a 3-page report. And also, we can see that shareholders actually consume as opposed to sending out a document, a video is going to get a lot more engagement from shareholders. Valuation and transaction history, this could be important just for tax purposes, cost basis. That's one area where we've helped clients is making it clear what the cost basis is for each of their shareholders. So you may be getting these questions anyway, but there are ways to systematically make the valuation history and the transaction history, clear and understandable to shareholders. Vision statements, those can be very delightful to shareholders and really make them feel like they're involved in the mission of the company. A distribution policy, that's going to come up probably, and we hear stories about cousin Jimmy won't stop bothering us about the distribution policy. And hand in hand with that brings us to our next topic, which is liquidity. So, everything I've spoken about so far has to do with transparency. And, I think it's a good segue into liquidity because you really can't have any liquidity without some level of transparency. And, this realization that we came to is, it's shareholders can't be expected to put their own value on a stock, regardless of the company, without some kind of transparency, and that extends all the way up into public companies, right? So, you need some level of transparency to even consider liquidity as an option. How do we see companies go about dealing with liquidity? So we'll most commonly see a 1-week window. And the reason that it's a 1-week window is because you want to kind of build up supply and demand and have it all happen, during 1 week, so that it's not an ongoing process that happens all year long. It can be very helpful, especially internally for your team, not having to go through this on a regular basis, but saying, okay, we're going to do it this 1 week, and then we don't have to worry about it for another year. Excuse me, I'm dealing with a cold, which about everyone else in the world seems like is dealing with.
Has me too, Graham. So,
so let's see. The price can either be fixed or it can be allowed to float between a floor and a ceiling. Most commonly we'll see, if they are going to let the price float, they'll allow for more upside than more downside. You don't want to necessarily let, depending on the company, generally more upside is just fine. And a way to kind of gauge what the demand and supply is going to look like is you can run surveys that are anonymous. Anonymity is kind of an important part of this, by the way. I don't want to get too off into a tangent, but you can run into situations where shareholders are kind of posturing and saying, oh, I want to buy more stock, but when it actually comes down to it, there's more hesitation. So, anonymity, and this is something that we just implemented at the end of last year. We ran a platform that was completely anonymous and used ACH payments. It wasn't anonymous, obviously, to the company. The CFO knows what the cap table looks like, but to the shareholders, they were all anonymous to each other, which, this company in particular was hundreds of shareholders. But I get it. You don't want you don't necessarily want the other side of your transaction to know who you are, and there's no requirement that that's the case. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say about anonymity. This is also operated as a listing service. The company obviously is not doing any kind of, they're not market making. The SEC is pretty explicit about not making a market in your own stock, but perfectly fine to operate it as kind of a listing service, meaning, a buyer wants to buy 100 shares and a seller wants to sell 50. There can't be someone sitting in the middle there saying, you need to, we'll just make this work. You basically, they're aware of each other, and the other side can just post and ask for 50 shares. So a little bit of a technical detail there, but just worth pointing out that the company's not making a market necessarily in the stock. And then lastly, just pointing out that none of this is quite as easy as just distributing a buy-sell agreement. As much as we'd like for it to be that easy, really delighting shareholders by giving them kind of a relief valve, a release valve on maybe some liquidity concerns that have come up, really sets you up for longevity. And I think that's what everyone is looking for. And I should probably have mentioned this at the top, but liquidity, when the way that we think of liquidity is not in terms of an exit event. We assume that every owner wants to hold on, own or manage their company indefinitely. That's just kind of our default stance. Looking at the clock here, I want to make sure I cover our last topic here, which is control. So this is the next question that comes up when you start, thinking about transparency and liquidities, especially for those, G1, G2s. Control is super, super important to them. So, we believe, and we've seen it, that engaging with shareholders can actually give you more control. Going back to cousin Jimmy, to let to not engage, and I think this goes without being said, but to not engage an unhappy shareholder is not a long-term strategy, right? So I think being transparent and communicative is going to always benefit you. As I said, liquidity is providing that relief valve for unhappy shareholders. It avoids potential conflicts. And if control is still a worry, there are levers that can be put in place. Some of these levers go into legal docs, and that's not necessarily. We're not lawyers, but you can have all kinds of limits put in place on if you are gonna provide some liquidity, then you can put limits on that. You can do it through non-voting stock. So there are plenty of ways to maintain control if that's really a priority, while still delighting shareholders. That's really our belief. Buybacks, I think, is the other thing that I was going to mention. Is you can have the company be a buyer of the stock if you want to make sure that that control is staying there. So I know that was a lot of talking, but I think I'll pause there. David, I don't know if you had any other questions come in while I was...
Yes, let's end at let's start at the end. When you mentioned buybacks, how common is that? The company just doing the buyback into it? I'm not sure how that works. Does the company then buy it, or shareholders of the company buy it back?
The company can definitely, the treasury can definitely buy it, and then that treasury can then reissue it to new employees, which is kind of nice. And I would say it's I don't want to say it's incredibly common, but obviously the companies that we work with, we see it quite often, and there's probably selection bias there, right? Like, they're in a position where, you know, they uh, they've got cash. It's like a cash generating business that, so that they can consider buying back potentially millions of dollars of stock a year. Um, I'm one in particular I'm thinking of is is in Knoxville, and they've been around for over 100 years at this point, and they they're quite aggressive actually with their buybacks, and they'll have a management incentive program also, where it's based on buying back. You don't leave the company and as a member of the management incentive plan and leave with your stock. The company says we're taking it back from you once you leave. Based on our valuation. So.
Okay. There was another thought, hadn't thought of my shareholders as investors, but of course they are. Are there any cons to thinking, or negatives to thinking to having them think this way, or thinking of them that way?
Any cons thinking of to shareholders thinking of themselves as investors?
Well, or thinking of the shareholders as investors, and in a family-owned business, of course, that's a depersonalized approach. But
it's possible that I'm thinking of public companies, which obviously are quite different, but
right.
You will sometimes come across activist investors in the public sphere, and I would guess
if you're Disney right now,
right? And I would guess that those public companies don't really appreciate those investors being as active as they are. So I suppose that's a possibility. Is that a shareholder gets into that mindset and says, I should be running things.
Right. Yeah.
Something like that. So.
Okay. And then I guess this one, it was very interesting because you're talking about being transparent and providing a lot of information to shareholders, to your investors. What if you provide all this and they don't bother to consume it? What do we do?
Yeah, it's common. I think it really depends on the person. And we'll sometimes get this question, like, I as the administrator, I put all this time into it, and only 50% of people actually cared to look at it. And they wouldn't have known if they'd sent out a mailing. They don't really know what the engagement rate is with the mailings. So yeah, I get that. It can be a little bit disappointing. When we're constantly trying to think of ways of how do you really engage people. So I think as you start to get into a rhythm, people start getting accustomed to actually seeing it in their inbox, and I think you have a better chance doing it than not. Like you have no choice but to try. Right.
Got it.
You'll inevitably end up with people that have no interest, and that's just the way it is. So
terrific. Well, thank you, Graham, very much. I really appreciate this, and it's always interesting to hear this kind of perspective. So do you have any kind of last thoughts before we transition to the next session?
Well, I hate to end on a somber note about some people not getting involved. I think basically getting shareholders to really be excited about the company is potentially one of the most important things for family businesses. So we really enjoy being a part of that process. So
terrific.
And thank you so much, David.
That is that's a great positive way to end the session. So thank you so much, Graham.